Hi, everyone. This is Marc Zawel, the co-founder of AcceptU, here today to present a webinar in partnership with Beat the GMAT on preparing for the fall application cycle. Before we jump into the presentation, I wanted to just bring two notes to your attention. The first is that you can download a copy of this presentation from our website. The URL is up on your screen. It's learnmore.acceptu.com/fall. And you can also schedule an assessment with one of AcceptU's former admissions officers. We can give you feedback on your candidacy, including ways that you can strengthen your overall applications. You can sign up for those assessments, again, on our website. The address is learnmore.acceptu.com/webinar. To give you a brief introduction to AcceptU, AcceptU is an MBA admissions counseling group comprised entirely of former admissions officers from top 25 business schools. Our counselors provide one-on-one virtual support, so by phone, Skype, and email, that has given hundreds of applicants a competitive advantage in the admissions process. More than 90% of our past clients have been accepted to one of their top three choices. To give you some background on myself, I'm the author of an admissions guidebook called Untangling the Ivy League that focused specifically on gaining admission to Ivy League schools. I have a bachelor's from Cornell University as well as an MBA from UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. As I mentioned before, all of our counselors here at AcceptU are former MBA admissions officers. We're one of the few admissions counseling groups that's comprised entirely of former admissions officers. And these counselors have admissions experience from a variety of highly selective top 25 business schools, including Columbia, Cornell, Wharton, Stanford, UNC. We feel that these counselors, because they have worked in admissions, are in a unique position to provide our clients with inside knowledge and guidance that allows them to differentiate themselves and improve their chances of getting admitted to these highly competitive business schools. So today we have a webinar on preparing for the fall application cycle. First, let me congratulate all of you for planning for this process early. Truly, in our experience, we've found the earlier that applicants begin to plan for this process, the more successful the outcome. So today, we're going to talk about three broad topics, and then we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into each of those topics. We're going to start specifically with a discussion around the components to your application. We hope that this will give you some sense of what needs to be completed and at what points allow you to put together a timeline for the coming months. Next, we're going to talk about strategic positioning. And strategic positioning is a really critical component to how you approach your MBA applications. We're going to talk about things like your story. We're going to talk about things like fit with a business school. And these more qualitative factors that you need to take into consideration when you're preparing your MBA strategic application can be really, really critical to your overall chances of gaining admission to these top business schools. Finally, we'll talk about what you can be working on now. As I mentioned before, in our experience, the earlier that applicants begin to plan for the process, the more successful the outcome. So how do you get a jump on this process now? How does starting to plan for this process today versus in the fall, how does that improve your chances of best positioning yourself and improving your chances of getting admitted to these top business schools? So let's start with the components to your application. So I know that many of you have been planning for this process for some time. There are others of you that perhaps are not even planning on applying this fall but are going to be looking ahead to next fall or even the subsequent fall. So let's just take a step back and think about, first, what are you going to need in order to apply to business school? As you know, the GMAT is typically required at top business schools. There are less competitive programs outside of, say, the top 50 that do not require standardized testing, but let's focus on top 25 business schools. Standardized testing, either the GMAT or the GRE, though typically the GMAT is required. We'll talk a little bit more about target scores, but just to give you some sense, you want to look at the business schools that you're going to be targeting, think about what the average GMAT score is at these schools, and then try to hit within where that average is. Now, business schools are also publishing ranges of scores, maybe the top, or excuse me, like the mid 80 percentile. So take a look at what those ranges are, and then focus on hitting as high in that range or above that range as possible. But keep in mind that your GMAT score is really only going to be one piece to your application. And certainly we're going to talk more about each of these other pieces of your application. Admissions officers, when they look at your applications initially, they are going to be assessing whether you have the academic qualifications to be a successful student within their program. For them, academic qualifications is really twofold. The first is the GMAT score. The second piece is going to be your undergraduate GPA. Now, your undergraduate GPA is also a piece that you can use when you start to identify programs of interest. You can look at what the average GPA is among incoming students. But the challenge with the GPA is that admissions officers are not just looking at the GPA. They're considering also the rigor of the university or the college which you attended, the degree which you earned, the classes that you took. So if you earn, say, a 3.3 GPA, it's difficult to compare that 3.3 GPA to another applicant who has a 3.3 GPA because you attended likely a different university, you majored in a different area, you took different classes. And so the GPA is important to help them get a sense of your academic qualifications. But the GMAT score is more helpful to them because it can help put your academic qualifications into perspective with that of other applicants. If you earn, say, a 680 or a 700 or a 720 on the GMAT, and then there's another applicant that scored those same scores or higher or lower, they know, because the GMAT has been standardized, how your performance compares to that of your peer group. So academic qualifications are a critical piece to your application. You're going to need to take the GMAT. Your undergraduate GPA is done. There's nothing that you can do with it at this time. If your undergraduate GPA is falling on the lower side or below the average GPA for incoming students at the programs that you're interested in applying to, then there's going to be more emphasis placed on your GMAT score. But again, the academic qualifications for most applicants to top 25 business schools is a given. If you don't have these academic qualifications, then you're going to have a very, very difficult time gaining admission to these types of programs. So if most applicants have very similar academic qualifications, the way in which admissions officers make decisions about whether to admit one applicant over another is by looking at the more qualitative pieces of the application. A lot of this is driven by your work experience. Typically, applicants to business school have between 3 to 5 years of full-time work experience. Full-time is full-time. It's not while you were taking classes. It's not other opportunities that you've had. It's full-time work experience. So again, you can look up, based on the programs that you're interested in applying to, the average number of years of work experience that incoming students have. You want to hit around what the average is. If you're falling a little bit below the average, if you're falling a little bit above the average, that's fine. You're going to need to be thinking strategically how you discuss whether the fact that you have more work experience or less work experience is going to make you a student that's able to contribute as part of your kind of application strategy, so to speak. But try to fall within that range. If you're applying to business school with no work experience, or if you're applying to business school with 10 or 12 years of work experience, and these are the extreme ends of the spectrum, then you really do need to give some good dedicated thought to how you're going to address this in your applications, because admissions officers are going to question whether you are a good fit for their program, given the fact that your work experience is not really aligned with what the average incoming student has. When you look at the pieces of the application, the essays are really the most important component. You need to think about how your essays are going to also tie into your resume, your letters of recommendation, your interview if you're conducting one. All of these pieces together form in sum, form the application, but they each need to be thought about in independent ways. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later in the presentation about how you build a strategy that ties and takes full advantage of each of these pieces so that in sum you're coming across as a well-rounded applicant to admissions officers. So you have your GMAT, you have your bachelor's degree, your undergraduate GPA, you have work experience, typically 3 to 5 years. Then you have the pieces of your application, your essays, your resume, your letters of recommendation, your interview if you're conducting one, and then, of course, you have your application fee. When should you get started with all of these pieces? Right now, if you are looking to apply this fall for admission next year, what we would recommend is that you start focusing on pre-application planning. Very broadly, pre-application planning comprises of your story strategy, your extracurricular activities, your community service, and your demonstration of interest. Story strategy is a topic that we're going to go into much greater depth with later on in this presentation. But when you're thinking about extracurricular activities, community service, and demonstration of interest, extracurricular activities are kind of an interesting component to the application, because the reality is that most MBA applicants who have full-time jobs, they don't have much time on the side to really get involved in much, if anything, outside of that. But when you talk to admissions officers, and all of our counselors here at AcceptU are former MBA admissions officers, so we really have insight into what admissions officers are looking for in applicants, they typically are drawn to the extracurricular activities of the personal interests or the personal stories of the applicant versus the professional. Because from an admission standpoint, when you are reviewing hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants who, again, have very similar academic qualifications, who have very similar career interests and career accomplishments, you want to feel a connection with the applicants that you are admitting, a very personal connection. So things like extracurricular activities or community service or things that show a side of the applicant that is really unique to that applicant because no one else is like that applicant with his or her interests and hobbies, that can be very beneficial. Now, when you're thinking about your extracurricular activities or community service or things like that, try to align them with your career goals. So, for example, if you're changing careers, maybe there's an opportunity for you to do some community service or volunteer work in the industry that you're now thinking about changing into. What that allows you is to make a stronger case to admissions officers about why you are interested in what you say that you are interested in changing to. Demonstration of interest is another important criteria that admissions officers are considering. The fact is, they want to admit applicants that are more likely to attend. And we'll talk more in the next couple of slides about why this is, as well as the ways in which you can demonstrate interest. But understand that admissions officers want to admit applicants who are serious about attending, and the steps that you can take now in order to demonstrate that interest above and beyond what most applicants are doing can, again, be very beneficial to you in the longer term. If you have not already, I would strongly recommend that you get your standardized testing started. This is typically something that holds up an applicant's ability to apply in, say, round one. They have not gotten either their standardized testing completed, they want to retake their standardized testing. If you're planning for this process 6 months in advance, get your standardized testing done. Take it, score as high as you can on the GMAT, and then put it aside. And now you have a good baseline to start to develop your school list. You have a good opportunity to focus your time on the other pieces of the application, which, as I've mentioned, are equally, if not more important than your academic qualifications. What happens very often with applicants is that they wait to take their standardized testing. They don't do as well as they want to on it, and then they have to retake it, which prevents them, say, from applying in round 1 or round 2. Then they retake it. They don't do as well as they want, so they'll retake it again, and now they're looking at maybe like a round 3 deadline. So if you're getting a jump on the process, get your standardized testing completed. We would not recommend that you take the GMAT more than 3 times. There's many reasons. There's many reasons for this, but that's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. Is don't just take the GMAT for the first time just to see how you do on it without any preparation. Prepare diligently for each time that you take the test. Understand that you likely will not raise your score unless you put in serious, dedicated effort to study in between the testing dates. And look at the variety of options that are available to you when it comes to standardized test prep. There are many applicants who do well studying on their own, so purchasing books and really having a self-study focus. There are others that do much better in class settings, which are much more structured and really force you to do the work if you don't have as much dedicated kind of self-initiative to study for the exam. And then there are others that do very well in one-on-one tutoring settings where they can focus on those areas where they need to see the biggest improvement and get much more personalized help. So whatever is going to work for you is going to work for you, but try to get your standardized testing completed early. This summer, you can focus on your application strategy as well as your essays. We're going to talk later on in this presentation specifically about application strategy, so I'll hold off on that for the time being. But as I mentioned before, after your academic qualifications, your GPA, and your GMAT score, really your essays are the most important piece. So you have to focus on getting them written and polished in a way that will help you stand out from other applicants and show the best side of who you are. The earlier you can have brainstorming sessions, the earlier you can start really digging into the key qualities that you're going to be highlighting in your application, the sooner you can begin working on your essays, the better they're going to be. This fall, you can then focus on the last few pieces of the application, your resume, identifying your letter of recommendation writers and determining what makes most sense for them to highlight in their letters that's going to tie into your overall application strategy, conducting your final application review. So after you've put in all your data points, making sure that you're going through this very thoroughly and ensuring that there's no mistakes there, preparing for an interview if you're going to be conducting one. Interview policies really do vary from one school to the next. There are some business schools that require interviews for all applicants. There are some that selectively interview. So that's another piece that you should be preparing for this coming fall. So why is it important to start early? You have time to shape your package. By that, what I mean is if you wait until the fall, really you don't have an opportunity to proactively change anything about you and your background. If you know, now that you're viewing this presentation in advance, that you need to build a compelling story in order to gain admission, then you can take steps right now to round out your experiences, to round out your package, so that when it comes to the fall, you can really package yourself up and position yourself in a way that will help you stand out. There's definitely, as I've said before, there's a real advantage to planning early because it allows you to do things now that you can use in support of your application later on. Starting early also will allow you to get your application in early. As many of you, I'm sure, know, applying in an earlier round has real benefits to applying in, say, a round 3 or a final round. It's not just about applying in round 1 versus applying in round 3. It's also about applying in an early round as early as possible. Excuse me, it's a mouthful. What I mean by that is if you have a deadline, you want to try to put and submit your application 2 to 3 weeks in advance of the application deadline. Most applicants will wait until 24 or 48 hours prior to the application deadline. There's a huge influx of application submission around that time, and it creates a backlog in the admissions office. So if you can get in your application in early, they'll start to process your application. They will notify you if there's any pieces of your application that are incomplete. You can have your application completed sooner, and hopefully your application will be reviewed sooner. And in that way, you will be one of the first that admissions officers are really reviewing, and that can be very helpful as well. Starting early, we feel, allows you to eliminate a lot of the stress associated with the process. If you wait until the fall, like I said, if your standardized testing gets tied up and you're backing up against these application deadlines, sometimes have to make difficult choices about whether you're going to scramble and try to get your application in before the round 1 deadline, or you're going to wait, and you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of applying in round 1 with not as strong of an application as you'd like, or waiting to apply in round 2 with a stronger application. If you start now, you should be able to hit get that application in by round 1 and not be stressing out a day or 2 days or 3 days prior to the application about completing your essay. Finally, you want to give yourself a cushion. Things come up with work, things come up in your personal life. This process is far more intensive than you probably think it's going to be. So starting early just allows you to bake in some additional time in the event that you get put on a job for work and you're going to be tied up for 3 or 4 weeks and not really have any time to dedicate toward your essays. Or something might come up personally where you're just not available to really focus on this. So getting the process started early just allows you to ensure that you're going to be able to get in your application as early as possible. You're going to be able to shape your package in a way that will help you stand out and try to survive this process with as little stress as possible. So that kind of covers the components to your application, what you'll need to complete, when we would recommend that you complete them. As I mentioned several times, now I want to focus on an overview of strategic positioning. In particular, I want to talk about your story. I want to talk about your fit with these business schools, and ultimately how your story and fit allow you to stand out and get admitted. So just to give you kind of a brief introduction to the application story, as I've mentioned, your GMAT and your GPA will be critical to demonstrating your academic competency. You need to be within range. But ultimately, it's your application story that will help you stand out. Your story is a logical, it's a compelling, it's a rational argument for why you should be admitted to business school. And those words were chosen for specific reasons: logical, compelling, rational, and we'll get into them a little bit in a couple of slides. But very quickly, it's about building a story that allows admissions officers to connect where you're coming from and where you want to go to in your career, and how business school is going to be the bridge that helps you get there. And so when we talk about logical, compelling, and rational, it's primarily talking about your goals, your career goals, your short-term goals, and your long-term goals. Are these goals logical? Are these goals attainable? Are these goals also aspirational? And we'll talk much more about goals in the next couple of slides. Importantly, your story is the message that you want admissions officers to hear. Admissions officers, if you're not going to tell your story in the way that you want to tell it, they're simply going to draw their own conclusions about you and your interest in going to business school and what you'll be able to contribute. And certainly, they're not going to be able to tell as compelling of a story as you will about yourself. So this application strategy and story building is just so important. You have to really invest the time at the outset to build this story strategy, because if you don't have a compelling story, admissions officers are going to look at you, they're going to look at your background, they're going to assess you very quickly, and then they're going to move on. As I mentioned, your story has to be relevant to your background. It has to tie into your future career interests, and also those qualities that make you unique. And qualities can be professional, but they can also be personal, which is why earlier in the presentation I was talking a bit about extracurricular activities, volunteer work, community service, things of that sort, because these personal qualities can be used in your story as well. So how do you tell your story? Consider the more qualitative pieces of your application as the best means for you to communicate your story, primarily through your essays, but also through your resume, through your letters of recommendation, and your interview if you're conducting one. As I mentioned before, you need to think about how all these pieces tie together. What role are your letters of recommendation going to play, and how is this going to relate to your essays, and how is this going to relate to your resume? And what qualities or experiences or differentiators are each of these more qualitative pieces of your application going to highlight? Because you don't want there to be redundancy or overlap between your essays and your resume and your letters of recommendation. Now, of course, if you have an amazing career accomplishment, you can use that in an essay, and you can also have a letter of recommendation writer talk about it, and you can also include it in your resume. I'm not saying that there are no circumstances in which you should not have redundancy or overlap with your story and utilizing these various pieces of your application, but it really you should think about these pieces as ways to show admissions officers different sides of who you are and what makes you different and unique. And if you're telling them the same thing over and over, it can be a bit redundant, and it can also be a waste of really valuable space for you to communicate your story to them. Your story is going to allow you to become someone beyond just a GPA or a GMAT score. As I said before, you want to be someone that admissions officers feel a connection with, someone that they feel strongly about. You have to think about admissions officers sitting in their offices reviewing hundreds, if not thousands, of applications, one after the next, after the next, after the next. And if you cannot build that type of connection with them, and you come across simply as numbers to them, it's very easy for them to just move on and move on and move on, given how quickly they're reviewing these applications. So it's really your story, not your GPA or your GMAT, that's going to determine whether you're admitted to or rejected from a business school. Now, if you have exceptional academic qualifications, a near-perfect GMAT, a near-perfect GPA, it's going to make it easier for you to be admitted. But there are also applicants each year with perfect academic qualifications that are rejected from top business schools. And certainly if your GPA or GMAT are on the lower end, you're going to need to focus much, much more on your application story. Because if your academic qualifications are raising doubts among admissions officers that you're going to be able to keep up with the very rigorous programs that they have, you better be able to address not just that deficiency, but show them why they should take you given that deficiency. The more compelling your story is around the fit with the business school, the more likely you are to be admitted. This ties very closely with demonstration of interest. And so in a few slides later on in the presentation, I'm going to talk about the demonstration of interest and the things that you can be doing now in order to demonstrate interest in these programs. But just to kind of give you a taste of it, fit is important because admissions officers are assessing whether you're going to be able to achieve your goals given your prior work experience as well as the resources that are going to be available to you as a student. So if you're applying to business school in order to make a change into a career, say, in supply chain management, and that business school doesn't really have that great of a supply chain management concentration, then it's going to be pretty hard for you to show them that it's a good fit. And in fact, they're going to have concerns that you're going to be able to achieve your goal. And the reason that can be detrimental to you is that admissions officers don't want to admit applicants that they don't feel confidently are going to be able to achieve their short-term or their long-term goals, because it's going to negatively impact their perception at a minimum of the students' ability to gain full-time employment after they graduate, which also ties very closely into many business school rankings. They're looking at the percentage of full-time, they're looking at the percentage of graduates who have full-time work, say 3 or 6 months out. So you need to, and we'll talk a little bit more about goals in the next couple of slides, you need to have goals that are both realistic, but they're also a little bit aspirational. So, as I've said, the key to the story foundation is fit. Fit is when you make it clear that this MBA program, this specific MBA program, will help you achieve your goals. And it's important to be specific. I know that there are a lot of similarities among, say, top 25 business schools, but you need to think about, why is this specific business school the best fit for me? Fit is really critical to your story because admissions officers, as I've said, want to admit applicants that fit and that have realistic expectations about what they'll be able to achieve. And there's a real balance when you build your goals, your career goals, around goals that are both realistic and attainable, but also aspirational. You need to set the bar high, but you don't want to set the bar so high. You also want to make sure that your short-term and your long-term goals show a clear progression. Admissions officers want to know, where are you coming from today? How does this tie into what you're interested in going into in the future with your short-term goals? How is our specific program going to help you achieve those short-term goals? Then, how do these short-term goals tie into your long-term career goals? How are all these pieces going to tie together? As I said before, if you have unreasonable expectations, or even if you communicate to them unreasonable expectations, or kind of a misalignment of programs and those expectations, admissions officers are wary because they're going to have unhappy or unsatisfied students. It's going to impact their giving. It's going to impact their ranking or their reputation, as I mentioned, with like the percentage of graduates who have full-time employment 3 months or 6 months out. So the goals and your fit with the school is a real kind of focus initially on building kind of that component to your overall story strategy. And then remember, business schools are businesses and students are customers, so they want to ensure high levels of satisfaction with their programs, and they'll be hesitant to admit applicants that they don't feel like they're going to be successful with, because it's just not, for them, it's not worth it. You'll only want to apply to schools that have the right programmatic fit. Fit is a hard thing to fake. If the school is not a good fit for you, it's really hard to convince them that it is. But here's the good news. Now that you're planning for this process early, is that you can mold yourself to fit in the coming months. And if you remember from a few slides ago, I mentioned the ability to kind of package yourself, to prepare to package yourself. This is exactly what I'm talking about. If you know that you have to show the fit with the program and with the business school, then what can you do right now in order to build compelling experiences or qualities that are going to demonstrate that fit, and in turn will improve your chances of getting admitted to these top business schools. So the elements to your story are really 3 key questions, and they're questions that as you embark on this journey, as you begin this process, you want to keep in the back of your mind. Because these are the questions really that you start to build your entire story around. The first is, why do you want to pursue an MBA? Which sounds really simplistic, but it's much more complicated than it seems at face value. You need to think about, are you looking to change careers? If you're looking to change careers, are you trying to change your industry? Are you trying to change your functional role? Are you trying to change both? If you're not looking to change your career, Are you looking to accelerate your career? If you are looking to accelerate your career, why can't you accelerate your career without an MBA? So when you're thinking about this question of why, you have to dig pretty deep. You also have to think about why you want to pursue an MBA right now. This ties into, as we were discussing earlier, the number of years of work experience that you have. If you have 3 to 5 years of work experience, then admissions officers understand likely why this is a good time for you to be applying to business school. If you have far less work experience, if you have far more work experience, there needs to be a focus on this question, because you're going to need to help admissions officers understand why you're applying to business school now as opposed to in 5 years or 5 years ago. Think also about why you want to apply to this particular business school. As I mentioned, among the top 25 business schools, there's a lot of overlap in terms of their strengths, but you need to look specifically at these programs and communicate to admissions officers what makes this particular program such a good fit. It's going to tie very closely into demonstration of interest, and we're going to talk about it in a couple of slides. So keep that kind of in the back of your mind. Final question is, what makes you different and what will you contribute? And when you think about differentiators, they can be both personal as well as professional. Personal is going to tie into those qualities that we discussed a little earlier: your family, your upbringing, any diversity, your hobbies, your extracurricular activities, your interests. Professional are going to be things like leadership, accomplishments, things of that sort. As I said before, it's typically easier to differentiate yourself personally than it is professionally. Also think about what are you going to contribute. And the reality is that most business school applicants, they talk about the same things in their essays. They talk about how they're going to join this club, how they're going to be president of this club. Admissions officers read it in every single application. So you have to take it a step further. You really have to dig in a little bit more and think about, beyond just simply being a leader within a club or organization on campus, what else are you going to do? And again, this ties into demonstration of interest, things that you can be working on now. We're going to talk about it in a couple of slides. Getting a better understanding of the campus, of the community, of the environment, and ultimately this will help inform exactly what you are going to be able to contribute in a way that's a little bit more differentiated than the average applicant. Whether or not you're directly prompted these questions in the essays, and many business schools will straight up ask you these questions in the essays. Some of them are a little bit more indirect. Maybe they aren't asking you them in explicit terms like this, but they're trying to get at answers to these questions. So whether you're being prompted of them indirectly or directly, you have to answer them because these are the questions that admissions officers want to know the answers to. And once you have a baseline for these questions, and here at AcceptU, we spend a lot of time working with our clients, helping them think about these questions before we do anything else with them in the process, because this is really the foundation to their application. You're then going to subsequently thread the messaging, meaning your answers to these questions, throughout your application materials, like in your essays, in your letters of recommendation, in your resume, in your interview if you're conducting one. So the last topic that I want to discuss today, and if you've had questions that are coming up over the course of this presentation, please chat them over because we'll have some time at the end to answer as many of those as possible, is what you can be working on now. How do you get a jump on this process today in order to best position yourself to get it admitted this fall? So really, what we would recommend is applicants work on 3 areas. I've already talked about standardized testing. I'll go into it a little bit in more detail in the next slide. I've mentioned several times throughout this presentation demonstration of interest, so I want to get into that a bit deeper and talk about where and why it's important and what you can do in order to demonstrate this interest. And then finally, support or quote-unquote evidence for your story. You know the need to build the story. What can you now do in order to build the support for your story so that when you are implementing your story through your essays and letters of recommendation and your resume this fall, you have a lot to draw from. You have a lot of evidence that you can point to. And this ultimately is going to allow you to have a much stronger story than you would otherwise. So things like activities, community service, which you've already mentioned, career progression, whether it's challenges, leadership, strong letters of recommendation. We'll get into all of this in more detail in the next couple of slides. So first with standardized testing, some of this is reiterating earlier slides, but your GMAT score, as I've mentioned, is going to drive some of your school search. You want to try to hit as close to your target program's mean or median score. You don't want to take your GMAT more than 3 times. And there is more emphasis that's placed on the quantitative section. Now, if you are an international applicant, again, there's not going to be an expectation that your verbal section is going to be as strong as your quantitative section, especially if English is not your first language. But also think about with your GMAT score, typically the more work experience that you have, the less important it is. If you have less work experience, there's going to be more emphasis on your GMAT score because there's not much else to really look at or assess. They have your GMAT score, they have your GPA, maybe you've had an internship or 2, maybe you have a year of work experience, but there's not a heck of a lot else. So they're really going to focus on your academics abilities. If you have many, many more years of work experience than the average incoming student, then there's going to be far less emphasis on your GMAT score. But for most applicants, 3 to 5 years, 3 to 6 years of work experience, the GMAT, the GPA are going to be important somewhat in driving your school search. You have to have the academic qualifications to pass that initial hurdle, to pass that initial review. So you have to be within range, hopefully toward the top end of that range, if at all possible. But beyond having the academic qualifications, as we've discussed, there are going to be many other factors that admissions officers are considering when deciding whether to admit or reject you. If your quantitative score is especially low, now is a great time for you to consider ways to brush up on it. You can take an online course in, say, finance or accounting or economics. You can take a summer course, whether it's at a local community college or at another university. This way you can point to not just your ability to do well in these types of more quantitative courses, but you're going to also show admissions officers that you took the initiative. You went above and beyond to really demonstrate to them that you have the analytical and the quantitative skills despite what your background might say. You can also try to take on more analytical responsibilities at work. So maybe you don't have a very analytical or quantitative job, but maybe there are responsibilities that you could take on that at a minimum will allow you to start to refine or build some of these skills. And then when it comes to your letters of recommendation, perhaps you can have your letter of recommendation writers highlight those responsibilities that you've taken on that are more quantitative in nature. Then you're starting to compensate for what might seem like a lack of quantitative or analytical skills. But again, this is something that you can do now. If you're 3 weeks or even a month or 2 prior to the application deadline, there's really not much you can do. What's done is done. But you're planning for this process early, so start thinking now what you can do with your analytical and quantitative skills if they're not where you want them to be. So I've mentioned this quite a bit over the course of the presentation, and I want to focus now on the demonstration of interest. As I've said, admissions officers, they want to admit applicants that, if admitted, they feel are more likely to attend. There's a couple reasons why. They want students that are excited about their programs. They don't want students enrolling at their business schools who wanted to go to 5 or 10 other business schools over theirs. But they also use yield, which is the percentage of admitted applicants who opt to attend, as an indicator of their reputation or prestige among their peers. Yield is oftentimes used in business school rankings. So they want that number to be as high as possible. They want as many of their admitted applicants to attend as possible. If you know that admissions officers want to admit applicants that, if admitted, they feel are more likely to attend, now is your opportunity to demonstrate this to them. If at all possible, you should be visiting these business schools. Obviously, for international students, this is not often possible or feasible, and it will not be held against you if you do not come and visit these business schools that you're planning on applying to. And there are other ways for you to demonstrate interest if you don't have an opportunity to come and visit. But truly, for domestic applicants, the best way for you to demonstrate interest is by going and visiting these schools. Go sign up online, go on an official visit, do a tour, sit in on a class, try to really immerse yourself in the culture of the business school. Eat in the dining hall, stop a student in the hallway and talk to them about their experiences. Talk to career services if you can chat with them even for 15 minutes about what type of career opportunities might be available to you. All of these things are going to give you a lot of fodder to draw upon in your application essays. If you can say, the reason I want to come to your business school is because when I visited, I talked to this current student, or I talked to this professor, or I met with career services, as opposed to what the average applicant is doing, which is saying, well, I looked at your website and I seem like, this is a good fit for me. It's really showing them above and beyond that you're doing what you have to do in order to differentiate yourself from other applicants. If you can't get to campus, certainly you can attend an MBA fair. They are held throughout the world. Admissions officers will travel around the world meeting with prospective students. If you can't get to campus, then go and meet with these admissions officers at these events. The admissions officers that are traveling to these events are typically the admissions officers that are responsible for reviewing applications from that part of the world. So for all you know, you're meeting with an admissions officer who's going to be reviewing your application. You want to note your points of contact. If you meet with a current student, if you meet with an alumnus, if you meet with a professor, if you meet with someone from career services, if you meet with an admissions officer, send them a note, send them an email, thank them for their time. Try to start to build a relationship with these individuals. You don't want to pester admissions officers. You don't want to bother them if you don't really have to. But if you can start to build a relationship over the coming months, if you have a question, you can send them an email, touch base, keep in touch with them. Then when it comes to reviewing your application, maybe when your application comes up, they remember who you are. They've already talked with you. They've already met you. They remember that they met you at a fair, or they met you on campus, or you've come and visited and you popped in and said hello to them. It's about creating more of a connection with these admissions officers, which, as I've mentioned, is really important in standing out from this sea of highly qualified applicants. And these points of contact are also, like I said, going to allow you to build much stronger application materials. The essays where you can talk about the proactive steps that you've taken in order to really show why this school is a good fit are so much more powerful than essays where you're basing your essays on research that you've done online. It's just not the same level of connection. Finally, you can be working now to build additional support or evidence for your story. So let's think specifically about this question of why do you want to pursue an MBA, and then you can, by thinking about this question, you can start to work backwards to support your response. As we talked about earlier, career acceleration versus career changing. If you're going in one direction, let's just use career changing for example. Admissions officers are going to want to know why you want to change careers and what you've done in order to better understand why this new industry or new function or new industry and function are a better fit for you. You also, so in thinking about, say, changing careers, you can have your extracurricular activities, you can have some community service that's aligned with this new new career interest that you've had. You can also professionally look to pursue perhaps more leadership positions if at all possible. Also understand that with your resume, you're going to want to quantify all of your accomplishments. We see so many resumes here at AcceptU initially of applicants who are just very descriptive in what they do at work. And to be completely honest, admissions officers do not really care what you do at work. They're much more interested in what you've been able to achieve. So start to think about, what have I achieved, not what do I do every day. And when at all possible with your accomplishments, you want to quantify them. What has been the impact that you've had on the company or the organization that you work at? Have you been able to increase productivity? Have you been able to increase revenue? What are those quantifiable accomplishments? So start thinking right now, what are those accomplishments that I'm going to be highlighting in my application? You also want to be thinking about building a portfolio of differentiators, as I mentioned before, personally, interests, hobbies, challenges that you've overcome, family, upbringing. These are all great ways for you to start to build a connection with the admissions officers who are going to be reviewing your application. Also consider professional differentiators. Maybe you have unique experience. Maybe you have unique leadership. Maybe you have unique accomplishments. Maybe your career interests are unique. Certainly, admissions officers are looking to build diverse and well-rounded classes of students with various career interests. If you're interested in finance or if you're interested in management consulting, you're going to be in a much broader applicant pool than if you're interested in something like entrepreneurship or if you're interested in supply chain management, which far fewer students are. So start thinking about, what direction are you going to go in order to stand out from other applicants. And then the last thing that you can do with your evidence or support for your story is starting to build really strong relationships with your letter of recommendation writers. Most letters of recommendation are okay. They're not amazing. They're not excellent. They're supportive, but they're not over the top. And if you really get to know your letter of recommendation writers, then they hopefully can write you even stronger letters of recommendation. And letters of recommendation are an important piece of the application that admissions officers are considering. So to wrap up, I always think it's helpful to hear and to break down everything that we've gone through, because it was a lot to cover in a short period of time. We talked about the components to your application, what you're going to need to have completed and when. We talked about strategic positioning, your story, your fit, and how these are critical pieces to standing out and getting admitted. And then we talked about what you can be working on now. How do you get a jump on this process with support or evidence for your story, with your standardized testing, with demonstration of interest. So with that said, I just wanted to reiterate what I had mentioned earlier, because I know that some of you had joined us late. First is that you're welcome to download a copy of this presentation from our website. The address is learnmore.acceptu.com/fall. And then I'd welcome all of you to schedule an admissions assessment with one of AcceptU's former MBA admissions officers, and you can do that online, again, on our website, learnmore.acceptu.com/webinar. So with that said, we've got a little bit of time here at the end. So if you have any questions about preparing for the fall application cycle, I'm happy to answer those in the time that we have remaining. So the first question is, can a strong professional profile balance the lack of compelling extracurriculars and community service? Certainly. Admissions officers review applications in a holistic way, and they look at all of the pieces of the application. If you don't have strong extracurricular activities or community service, then you better have other things that are really, really strong. And so if you have a very, very strong professional background, work experience, accomplishments, and leadership there, then there's going to be less interest on the extracurriculars and community service. And there's going to be probably more understanding that given the accomplishments that you've had at work, you just have not had the time. The next question is, if aiming to apply for round 1, what should be the right time to take the GMAT? Is July 4th too late? I think that the earlier you can take it, the better. July 4th, I don't feel like would be too late. It depends on what score you're targeting, how much you're doing to prepare for it, and ensuring that you have adequate time to retake if needed. So July, taking the GMAT for the first time in early July, that would be fine. But understand that if you don't do as well as you want to on it, you're going to have to very quickly kind of start to get the other, testing dates scheduled out to retake. There's just a question about what is yield. Yield is the percentage of admitted applicants who opt to attend that particular business school. Another question here, do courses from Coursera make a difference? Should we invest time in this in the coming months? I think online courses through Coursera would be interesting for an applicant to take, especially if it's related to your future career interests or if you have weaker quantitative or analytical skills. Online courses are a good, cheap, or free alternative to taking classes at a local university or at a local community college. So I'd certainly encourage you to consider the online options as well. Another question here, for international applicants, how can they best engage with current students, alums? Most business schools have students, current students that are called admissions ambassadors or something along those lines that have volunteered to speak with prospective students. You can search for these students on the website based on your career interests. If for some reason that particular business school does not have this type of program for prospective students, you can you have two options. The first is look at the clubs. If you are looking at the various career clubs, you can contact the president or the vice president of a club and tell them that you're a prospective student and want to talk with them very briefly about their experience. Or you can just contact the admissions office and ask them if they have any particular students that they could connect you with. In terms of alums, not as formalized. Maybe if you contact the admissions office, they might be able to connect you with an alumnus that lives locally to where you are located. Or you could see if there are local alumni clubs that are, again, local to where you are that might have some alums that would be willing to speak with you about their experiences. Another question, and I'm going through them quickly so I can get to as many as I can. How often would you recommend reaching out to admissions officers? Don't go overboard because you will annoy them and it will not help you. But it says really you want to, if you meet them, say at an MBA fair, follow up with an email, and then maybe in a month or 6 weeks later, there's some question that's come up. It's not a question that you can easily find an answer to on the school's website. And this way you can kind of just keep in touch with them informally. And so don't go, and I hope you don't go overboard with this because it really can be detrimental if you kind of go too far with your contact with them, but keep it casual, keep it informal, and keep it when possible, ongoing over the next couple of months. Who are typically good people to approach to write your letters of recommendation? You want to be looking at supervisors, you want to be looking at coworkers or peers. You want to be thinking about letter of recommendation writers, both professional as well as perhaps personal, which is oftentimes overlooked among applicants. When do, there's another question here, is age ever a factor in the admissions process? No. If you have, as I said, if you have much more work experience than the average incoming student, then you're going to just need to spend more time explaining why you're applying to business school now as opposed to why you didn't apply to business school 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. The last question that I think we have time for is about how many schools on average should you plan to apply to? Well, I think that depends on, and that's a really good question because I think it depends on a couple of factors. The first is, one, do you want to go to business school next year? There are some students that want to only go to business school if they can get into certain business schools. There are other students that want to go to business school next year. If you're falling into that latter category, you have to make sure that the schools that you're applying to and the list that you're applying to is balanced. Now, the good thing about applying in an early round is that you'll get your notifications, and then you can make decisions about applying to additional schools if you don't feel like you're happy with the options that are available to you. With all that said, I would say that on average, at least the students that we work with here at AcceptU are applying to between 4 and maybe 7 business schools. Ensuring, again, that it's a mix of safety schools, match schools, and reach schools, so that the applicant has some options to choose from at the end of the process. So I think that's all the time that we have for today. Just to remind you all, you're welcome to download the presentation. The link is up on your screen. You're also welcome to contact us to schedule an admissions assessment. But I want to thank you all for joining me here today. As I've said several times throughout this presentation, there's a real benefit to planning and preparing for this application process early. So kudos to all of you for doing so. So we will be hosting additional webinars over the next couple of months, and we look forward to having you all join us again in the future. Thanks so much.